Good to see you. And thank you, Superintendent. Thank you, Jeffrey.
Okay.
I just have to plug my laptop in. I'll be right back, Council Edwards.
No problem.
And
August 10th, 2020, and we are here today for a virtual hearing on Docket 0811, Ordinance restricting the use of chemical crowd control agents and kinetic impact projectiles. This matter is sponsored by Councilors Ricardo Arroyo and Councilor Andrea Campbell and was referred to the committee on June 17th. In accordance with Governor Baker's March 12th executive order modifying certain requirements of the open meeting law, we are having this hearing on Zoom. This enables the City Council to carry out its responsibilities while adhering to public health accommodations. The public may watch this meeting via live stream at www.boston.gov/city-council-TV. It will also be rebroadcasted at a later date on Comcast 8 RCN 82/Verizon 1964. For public testimony, written comments may be sent to the committee email at ccc.go@boston.gov and will be made part of the record and available to all councilors. In short, Docket 0811 would restrict the use of chemical crowd control agents and kinetic impact projectiles by law enforcement in the city of Boston during protests, demonstrations, and gatherings. I will now turn it over to the lead sponsors of the docket. Before then, I will announce all of the councilors who are here, and then we will formally start this hearing. As mentioned, here today present, Councilor Campbell and Councilor Arroyo, who are the lead sponsors of this docket, followed by Councilor Flynn, Councilor Braden, and Councilor Sabi George. Have I missed any of my fellow councilors? Okay. We are also joined by several guests today, Superintendent Ridge and also Deputy Superintendent McGoldrick, Dr. Rohini Har, Attorney Foyer from the National Lawyers Guild, and Attorney Rasan Hall from the ACLU. Turning it over now to the lead sponsors. And I apologize, Superintendent, I said your name incorrect. Superintendent Ridge.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll keep this brief so that we can make the most of the time we have with our panelists. But the purpose of this is chemical crowd control agents are actually strictly prohibited in warfare due to the Geneva Protocol of 1925. Tear gas and the things that we're seeking to restrict here would actually be illegal if used on enemy combatants in a war zone, but are perfectly legal to use on our constituencies. And so if that's the case, and we know very well that, and we'll hear testimony to the fact that these crowd control agents, whether it's kinetic rubber bullets, pepper spray bullets, pepper spray, or tear gas, have incredibly disruptive and in some cases fatal impacts on people's health. And so this is an attempt, if we're not going to outright ban it, and this isn't an outright ban, we should be restricting it. We should be making sure that the highest levels of, restriction are put on something that can have that kind of impact, that can have a discriminate impact on people doing legal or lawful assembly, that can have an impact on people from as young as you can take to a rally or a protest, or as old as exist. I've been in protests myself with 70, 80-year-old folks. And this has a disparate impact on different ages, different genders, all kinds of issues. And so this is an attempt to try to make sure that we're protecting the safety of our constituencies by restricting them to the best of our ability. And I would just note that other cities have already banned it. You have mayors who have, through executive order, put in bans. There's lawsuits currently pending in several municipalities, LA, Seattle, Denver, and Minneapolis, to make sure that these chemical crowd control agents and kinetic impact projectiles are no longer used by law enforcement. And so this is an attempt to get ahead of that here in the city of Boston. I would add in closing, we know that this is that these things are dangerous. Victoria Snellgrove, rest in peace, in 2004, was killed by a rubber bullet to the eye in Boston during the 2004 World Series championship celebration that was occurring outside of Fenway. And so we have personal experience in the city of Boston with the dangers of these things. And so with that in mind, I'd like to now hand it over to my co-sponsor, Andrea Campbell, if possible. Thank you.
Councilor Campbell?
Thank you, Councillor Edwards, and thank you, Councillor Arroyo, for the partnership. We are in an important moment right now in which we're examining, questioning, and rewriting how policing and public safety are done in the city of Boston so that these systems are more accountable, transparent, and most importantly, just. People exercising their lawful First Amendment rights during a protest or demonstration shouldn't be met with destructive and even deadly weapons. Although chemical crowd control agents and kinetic impact projectiles are often referred to as non-lethal methods of controlling crowds, they cause incredible discomfort and pain to those they are used upon. And with prolonged use, they can cause permanent harm, such as blindness, or in severe cases, death. These agents also have a deleterious environmental effect as chemicals settle and linger for days after use. As indiscriminate weapons by design, these agents, which Councillor Royal also spoke to, are especially difficult to direct away from bystanders or groups especially affected, such as children, the elderly, and those with pre-existing conditions. And in the midst of COVID-19, I think we have to be extremely mindful of that. There's a lot that this ordinance does to demilitarize our police and police response to large-scale demonstrations and events that I think all of us support. But I am looking forward to making sure that this is a robust conversation. I want to thank the panelists again. We have representation from the police department, which is critically important to this conversation, as well as from legal experts and advocates. And one of the things I also want to stress is, of course, we want to make sure that we protect our residents, and that absolutely includes our police officers who are on the front lines every single day. And so I do think I'm looking forward to this hearing and discussing what are some other alternatives or how we restrict the use of these agents only in the most severe of circumstances. Lastly, I have to give a special shout out and thank you to Sadie, who's one of our amazing summer interns who did a lot of research on this topic, including looking at best practices in other municipalities across the country. We all know we have limited human capital in our council offices, so our interns and fellows play a really incredible role. In this summer, they've done a really incredible job, so a special shout out to Sadie on my team. Thank you again, Councillor Royal, for the partnership, and thank you, Councillor Edwards.
Thank you. Councillor Flynn.
Thank you, Councillor Arroyo and Councillor Campbell for filing this important matter, and for Councillor Edwards for chairing this hearing. I'm here to learn more about the ordinance, hear from stakeholders about how we can best utilize our police resources and be able to protect people who are protesting or demonstrating, but also protecting our police officers as well. I know we highlighted some of the issues that have happened in the past, but I'd like to know if there are demonstrations taking place, taking away this option for the police. What impact would that have on public safety in general? Those are the types of questions, those are the types of answers and questions I hope to ask during this debate. Again, I want to say thank you to my colleagues for filing this and for Councillor Edwards for chairing it. But I'd also like to say thank you to the Boston Police Department for being here as well, for being very responsive and professional on these matters. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Braden.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to the makers for bringing this important issue forward. This issue is personal to me. I grew up in Northern Ireland, and that's where they invented the rubber bullet for use against civilian protesters in the streets of Northern Ireland. And they were used with the result of 15 people actually dying from the use of rubber bullets. And so it's very personal to me. I understand the need for effective ways to try and manage protests, street protests that are turning violent and getting out of control. But I really do feel strongly that these rubber bullets are not non-lethal, that they're very dangerous, and that we would I'd like to see a protocol that and measures to have clear protocols for when they should be used in circumstances such as public disorder. I look forward to the conversation. Thank you so much for the wonderful range of folks on the panel, police department, etc. And I look forward to learning more and coming up with a policy that will make this a method of last resort in our city. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Asabi George.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't have any sort of formal opening remarks, just happy to be here and looking forward to having a better understanding of the policies and procedures that are currently in place and how we can work in collaboration to make them more appropriate and I think a better understanding and a deeper understanding, not just for us, but for the general public as well. I appreciate the makers bringing this before us and look forward to today's conversation. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I see we've been joined by Councillor Matt O'Malley. Councillor O'Malley, we're just doing brief opening statements.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I shall be brief. Just wanted to thank the makers, Councillor Royal and Councillor Campbell. Thank you, Madam Chair, and to our panelists. Agree with everything that's been said by my colleagues. Obviously, you know, something that's deemed non-lethal can be lethal as it relates to tear gas and other chemical agents. We're learning more and more how they can have just a disastrous effect, particularly on reproductive health. Particularly on trans men, and it's just an important conversation to have to make sure that we can always, and I know we all share this, every person on the Zoom shares this, doing what's right for the safest policies and procedures that we will affirm, and making sure that these are obviously the last resort. So look forward to the question and answers, look forward to learning more, and look forward to supporting the two lead sponsors in this endeavor. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't see any other city councilors, so I'll just briefly state I'm excited about this. I just have several points that I hope we can cover today. I'm curious about the 8 can't wait and how that is measured with the non-lethal on that continuum. I'm curious about if no tear gas, if no rubber bullets, are we just left with regular guns or batons? What is in their toolkit? What is the demonstration protocol with regards to de-escalation? I understand the use of non-lethal force is important, intended to make sure that we don't hurt people beyond necessary, but I am curious how we're using it to de-escalate. I don't know that it necessarily does, or maybe it's not intended to. I've never actually seen a rubber bullet. So I'm curious, I don't know if anyone brought one, but I've never seen one. I don't know what they look like or how is it supposed to work? Is it just supposed to be a hard ping against the body? So I'm curious to literally learn about that. I know about tear gas. And then finally, I am curious about the reporting requirements for the use of non-lethal force. Is there something after the fact in a protest that we learn about the use and the impact and who got hit and who didn't, and why? So I'm here to learn as much as possible. I do appreciate all the guests who are here to help us educate us and also help to form the best policy. I was informed by one of the co-chairs, or excuse me, one of the makers that Dr. Ramini might have to leave sooner than later. So if it's okay with everybody, we normally go to the administration and we normally start with the police, but we're going to go ahead and start with Dr. Ramini for some presentation. Doctor?
Hi, thank you. And thank you for having me. I don't, I know I just want to speak for a short amount of time, and I'm hoping to just give you a little bit of information about our research and what we know about crowd control weapons from the medical side. So just as background, I am an emergency room physician in Oakland, California, and adjunct professor of epidemiology at UC Berkeley. So I practice twice a week in the ER, where I often see tear gas and pepper spray, and sometimes, rarely, thankfully, see injuries from rubber bullets. And I also do research on this dating back to 2014. So most of the slides and images I'll present today are based on a long systematic review we did of all of the injuries we could capture in the medical literature between 1990 and 2015. And then I'll give you a brief update on what we've understood from the past few months. I will say thank you for having me today, and it's really unusual to get to be a researcher and share information with legislative bodies and policymakers who actually make a difference. So this is very exciting for me as well to see how the law is made. And then, Ms. Edwards, you mentioned you'd never seen a rubber bullet, so I'll just show you one right now. So this is one I picked up, not in the US, but this is a typical foam baton. And I don't know if we use exactly the same ones in the US, but it has like very, very hard foam on top and a plastic base at the back. And you can see it's kind of like a bullet, but also large and a bit softer. There's actually, I'm going to share screen. What I'll do is very briefly share some information about these weapons and their injuries, and then afterwards I'd be happy to answer any questions or stay on for a bit. So the one I showed you is a little bit like the blue one over here, but that's not the only kind of rubber bullet. One of the major issues with doing this research is that all different kinds of weapons are used in the US, and Boston, I'm sure, uses a range of different ones. But there's foam batons, there's beanbag rounds. These are rubber-coated metal bullets, which thankfully we don't use much in the US. Different kinds of foam and rubber baton, and then these are sometimes called stingers. We call them scatter shot, where there's multiple balls inside a single canister. So when they fire, you fire a bunch at once. As you can expect, there's a range of severe injuries that are caused by these rubber bullets, which I'll speak about first before tear gas. And the vast majority are to the skin or the bones, muscles, limbs, and lacerations, things like that. But you can see that there's also injuries to the eyes, to the lung, the head and neck, and the belly. Forgive me if these are a little bit graphic, but I want to give you an actual perception of what we see in the emergency room and what kind of injuries occur from the use of rubber bullets. Oftentimes we call these non-lethal or less than lethal, but I would argue very strongly that those are incorrect terms that should be retired. These are very much lethal. It all depends on how they are used and when they're used and how often. So again, forgive me for some of the graphic pictures, but you can see this young man got shot by the scatter shot bullets. So there's multiple injuries. If he was farther away, this could hit multiple people at once. This is a young man during the Black Lives Matter protests in 2014. You can see it caused a pretty big dent in his forehead. An inch below, he probably would have lost his eye. I won't show you too much of like graphic eye injuries, but you can see that that's one of the major issues we run into, is that when they hit the eye, these rubber balls can easily penetrate the eye and cause essentially permanent blindness. These look like scattershot bullets on the back, but you can also see that there's one that hit up here. This caused internal bleeding and kidney damage in this man. And this is even more concerning, but when they hit from close range, these bullets go almost as fast as live ammunition. They can fracture the skull, sometimes lodge inside the skull. You can see a few pictures of that, of this hitting so hard that it actually fractured the skull. That's pretty clear on that one. And then this, I think it entered through the temporal bone, and you can see it that it fractured and lodged in its skull. These are essentially unsurvivable injuries, and occasionally just cause permanent brain damage to the point that this person probably can't be very functional. Our summary about these projectiles is that they're inaccurate, they're unreliable, and they're dangerous. And I'll briefly share that just in the past 3 months, we have been using social media and online investigation to try to identify how many injuries have occurred just since the murder of George Floyd. And so far, just using online sources, we have identified over 116 people with significant head and neck head, neck, eye, and face injuries. That will be published in the next few weeks. But that's a pretty dramatic number for just 2 months in the US alone. I'll share a little bit more about tear gas, because I don't want to make it sound like this is somehow totally safe and, you know, rubber bullets are super dangerous, ban those, and then keep tear gas, because again, it's about how they're used just as much as which weapons they are. So the canisters we know about confirmly more commonly, but there's also canister grenades. There's also pepper spray, of course, and other kinds of spray. As you can expect, most of the injuries that we see there are also to the skin and eyes, but the real deadly injuries from chemical irritants are typically respiratory or often from the canister themselves to the brain, the skull. I'll show you pictures. This is skin irritation on a child. This is what we sadly expect from tear gas, but this is what we're often seeing as well. Here's a very clear canister injury. You can see the mark of the canister on this man's belly. This is actually a military recruit who was exposed to tear gas as part of basic training, and he developed a terrible, almost chemical burn-like reaction. This is another gentleman who got a chemical burn to his face. This would take weeks and weeks to heal with scarring. This is someone who developed an allergic reaction to the tear gas in the UK. And you can see in this man, his face got a chemical burn, and then as it dripped down his chest, he developed a burn there as well. The canister itself is an explosive, and so when it hits the skin, it can actually cause explosive burns. And of course, we know it can cause pretty severe injuries to the eye. As I mentioned, most of the deaths, and we've identified over 50 deaths from tear gas, are because of either the canister injuries to the head or because of respiratory damage to the lungs. So you can see all this white schmutzy stuff here. That's abnormal. And here is a bronchoscopy image of the same young woman. On the right, you can see normal. This was 3 months later. And on the left, you can see how much tissue breakdown actually occurs in the lungs when you're exposed to tear gas. We conclude in our research that tear gas is indiscriminate. So you can't identify a single or a group of violent protesters and tear gas them. What you have to do is disperse the entire crowd. And when you do that, you are at risk of exposing bystanders, children, the elderly, people with asthma, and all kinds of other issues. And ultimately, these weapons, they tend to escalate tensions and make the situation worse rather than safer. There's a range of other weapons that people often use in the US that I'll just be very briefly mention, but among those are stun grenades, which can cause burns. ProPublica did a report in 2015 identifying over 50 people who died because of stun grenades, and water cannons, which we thankfully don't use too much in the United States, but are starting to bring back. They can also cause pretty significant injuries. I will conclude by saying that I know you asked, and a lot of people ask me all the time, well, if PHR is calling for banning all of these weapons, then police don't have a range of use of force. But you know, we're not starting from scratch. There's many countries all over the world that don't use these weapons. And I think when you ban these weapons, when Boston takes a step like this, what you're going to do is force more dialogue and more open communication. That actually is the solution. I'll stop there and ask if you have any questions specifically about the weapons or the health impacts.
Thank you very much, Dr. Har. We've also been joined by Councillor Flaherty and Councillor Mejia. Councillor Flaherty or Councillor Mejia, if you had any brief remarks. If not, I would turn over to allow some colleagues to ask questions.
I would like to just move to the questions. Thank you for hosting, and looking forward to participating in the dialogue.
Thank you. Councillor Flaherty? thought we had him. He may have had some technical issues. Okay. Very well. I see you, Counselor. I see you.
I'll come back with you, Madam Chair, in a second. I'm just trying to, I guess, a little difficulty here.
Yeah. We'll skip the opening remark, Counselor Flaherty, and we'll see if we can't get a better connection for questioning, if that's okay. I didn't know if anyone had any quick questions for Dr. Parr, or if it makes sense to the makers maybe to have maybe some introductions or some remarks from the police as well. So the questioning kind of goes for all of them.
I'm okay with letting the other panelists go.
I'm okay with that as well. And then we can have questions as a whole.
Yeah, and then I think we would have, yeah. Councilor Flynn, I saw your hand up. Did you have a brief question, or were you okay with waiting? You're on mute.
Thank you, Councilor Edwards. I know you want to get on to the others, but I just had a question for the doctor. During these, the pictures that you showed us, they took place across the country. But do we also know if any of the, public safety people or that were working these nights also were injured by any of these types of, no, I wouldn't use the word weapons, but were they injured at all because maybe other protesters may have had these similar equipment?
I know of no reports in the US where public safety workers were injured by crowd control weapons. It is common, and I think our police officers can talk a little bit more about this, but tear gas and pepper spray, especially because they're sensitive to the wind conditions and things like that, sometimes often do spray back in the law enforcement's face. And I know in Oakland anyway, police are loath to use pepper spray unless they have to, because if it's windy or if they have to arrest the individual, they sometimes get exposed themselves to pepper spray, and it doesn't feel great. And in the past 2 months that we've looked at, I know there's been a number of injuries to law enforcement officers, but I don't think those have been from any of these weapons.
What is the most common injury to a...
Councilor Flynn, after this one, we're gonna let the other panelists go, okay?
Okay.
After you ask this quick question and the exchange.
Yeah, what is the most common injury that a public safety person would have during a demonstration from the demonstrators? What would some of those injuries be?
I'm probably not the right expert for that because I don't study the injuries on the law enforcement side. It's also impossible to study probably because those aren't necessarily I'm an epidemiologist, so we study. If we don't have public records, it's hard for us to identify those, and
thank you, Doctor.
So it's hard to get that information.
I'm sure BPD could speak to their experiences. Speaking of which, we have 4 additional panelists. I know I saw you, Councillor Braden, but I really want to get to the other panelists. Okay, thank you. Excuse me. So I told you, Superintendent, I'd be calling you a counselor soon. Superintendent Ridge, then Deputy Superintendent, if you would like to follow after him, or if you're speaking together. And then I'd like to go to Attorney Foyer, you corrected me before, I'm sorry, attorney from the NLG, and Rasan Hall. Then everyone would have kind of done some introductory remarks, and that allows for a robust conversation. So Superintendent, kind of an overview, and then we'll allow for other people to speak as well.
Okay, very good. Good morning. Appreciate the ability to be able to speak to the hearing today. Just some background information on myself. I've been a police officer since November of 1983. I've been currently the Bureau Chief of Field Services since 2017. Before that, I was the Assistant Bureau Chief from 2014 to 2017. Prior to that, I was the commander of the Special Events Unit. So I want to say in my career, I've been to hundreds and hundreds of demonstrations, both situations where, you know, the police have been put in the middle, keeping two groups separated. You know, there's been situations where we've had to use some type of force. However, in my almost 37 years as a police officer, the only time that we ever used what we're calling tear gas was May 31st. In 37 years, that's the only time we had to do that. That was not a peaceful demonstration. It was a riot. Our officers were being attacked. They were being attacked with frozen water bottles. They were being attacked with rocks, bricks. We still have officers that have been out injured from broken arms, from what they call them M80s, firecrackers, quarter sticks of dynamite, whatever. Those were thrown at our officers. And the ability for us to defend ourselves needs to be maintained. We cannot leave our officers on the line with basically what you mentioned, Counselor, with a stick and a gun. We need tools. We need tools to be able to disrupt and disperse these groups that are attacking us. And they're attacking us, again, not to get into any political considerations, because we've been there countless times. You know, our job has always been to protect everybody's First Amendment right to peacefully protest. But when we have a situation where our officers are being attacked, I know the doctor mentioned she hasn't heard of it before, but our officers were attacked with CS gas. The protesters were throwing CS gas, and they were also using pepper spray on our officers, along with a number of other projectiles that were coming down towards us. In particular, you know, when you talk about a peaceful protest, we had people there that had their own gas masks. They had leaf blowers to blow any chemical munitions that were thrown at them back at the officers. They had people with welders' gloves that were able to pick up munitions to throw back at the officers. So this was a well-prepared group of rioters, not peaceful protesters. And the only times that, like I said, that I've used it in my 37 years was that night of May 31st. And again, it was not a peaceful protest, that was a riot. And our officers were being attacked, and our officers were being hurt, specifically because they were Boston police officers. So, you know, the ability for us to defend ourselves has to be paramount. It has to be taken into consideration when we're looking at this particular ordinance. You know, the safety of my people, to me, is paramount. To be able to put them on the line with limited resources really becomes problematic. You know, the less lethal option, if you will, is it lethal in certain circumstances? It could be. However, when you have quarter sticks of dynamite thrown at you, when you have frozen water bottles thrown at you, when you have sticks, rocks, bricks thrown at you, that escalates. That is no longer a peaceful demonstration. And pretty much, you know, our people held the line as best they could under extremely trying circumstances that evening. And I, at no time do I ever want to be able to restrict the use of any of those options. In particular, when we use those options, those are the permission is given strictly at the highest levels. It would be the Chief of Field Services, myself, and Police Commissioner Gross. We would be the only ones that are authorized that, and that's basically in our rules of engagement. So it's not like we're out there indiscriminately using this stuff. You know, like I said, I've been to hundreds and hundreds of demonstrations. and that's the only time we've ever had to resort to using those type of weapons in basically to defend ourselves. So,
Thank you.
thank you.
Deputy Superintendent, I don't know if you wanted to add to or your thoughts as well.
Yes, thanks. I would just say we need to be careful to look at a few different sides of this issue. It's not just a question of whether the police are using a certain type of force. There's also the risk involved in letting a riot run unabated or be controlled ineffectively. There's obviously downside risks to the public when that happens. So this is a means of stopping a riot, stopping violence, stopping some destruction, which, you know, there's plenty of environmental impact to that as well. I mean, numerous fires were lit, and including on some public property and parks. I personally saw some fires in the public gardens, and you know, there's other risks than just the risk of us using riot control agents. And to the doctor's point about dialogue and communication, I agree 100%. That is usually effective for us. That is usually the course of action that we take with great success. We make every effort to make contact with people, especially if there's two different sides that have issues with each other. That is our plan, and that is what we execute every time with almost 100% success. We do have to realize, though, especially recently, there are people that want to do harm, cause chaos, cause injury. Unfortunately, we've seen more of that than I have ever seen in my career. And just as the superintendent mentioned, I've never seen these riot control agents and sponge rounds, which is much different than, you know, to the point of the previous speaker. The sponge rounds we use are much different, much more engineered than the rubber bullets of the 1970s Northern Ireland, which I know were quite catastrophic and nothing that we would consider appropriate for use in Boston. Even the sponge rounds that we're very careful to use judiciously, this is the first time I've seen them used, the first time that they've been authorized to my knowledge. So that's, you know, and we would obviously take great care because there is risk. No one's diminishing the fact that there is risk when you use impact weapons like that. And no one's diminishing the fact that there is risk involved in riot control agents, but it's a balance of risk, correct? Like in everything that we do, we want to balance the risk of action versus other action or no action. And I think on the night of the 31st of May would have been quite calamitous if we didn't take action. And unfortunately, we used a lot of the other tools that we typically use, including engagement. And I will say, the vast majority of the protesters there that evening were peaceful protesters. And as they started to leave, people who had clearly no intent on being peaceful protesters, bringing the explosives that they brought, bringing canisters, military-grade canisters of CS and CN gas. Clearly, there's some people who weren't going to take peace for an answer. So that's problematic. Just looking a little bit at some of the restrictions on the ordinance itself, a couple of my concerns are it makes no allowance for, say, a sudden attack where the public is at risk. I did see on the evening of the 31st that there was a car with a young child in it, and they were trying to safely get out of the area. That would be challenging to do if we had to wait and get approval to use even to use pepper spray. So defense of others, self-defense, I think we should probably consider working that into the wording somehow, including trying to get EMS and fire assets to someone who might be injured. Perhaps, you know, if someone has a weapon and they're causing chaos inside of a crowd, maybe we want to consider some options for using impact weapons on that particular person without having to wait for them to actually use that violence among the crowd. I would also point out that the categorization of any group of 10 or more, and basically any group whatsoever, occasionally there are large crowds in bars downtown, and you will have more than 10 people fighting. You will have people being violently attacked, and you might have only one or two officers showing up initially. Using the pepper spray that they would typically have on their belts can disperse the crowd pretty quickly and save people significant injuries. I know it seems perhaps like a trivial thing, but if you've seen some of the results of some of these bar fights and fights at events that involve people being kicked in the head or struck with objects, the additional time it would take to get sufficient resources there to intervene rather than using pepper spray to get some people safely extracted from that area or prevent some of the violence and address the others it makes a difference. My other point would be that the more we remove less lethal and non-lethal options, the quicker we run out of those options. And I think we should do that with due caution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Attorney Foyer?
Yep. My name is Jeffrey Foyer. I'm an attorney in a small community-based law office. I'm here representing the Massachusetts chapter of the National Lawyers Guild. You've heard from the expert physician, Dr. Har, about how dangerous and even deadly these weapons can be. I want to talk to you now about how these weapons are being used on our citizenry recently, unnecessarily, and indiscriminately. The ordinance that's being proposed is not a ban, it's merely reasonable restrictions. And as much as Superintendent Ridge and Deputy Superintendent McGoldrick talk about using other methods, we cannot rely on them always being in charge, always being in the police force. Eventually they will retire. There will be other officers who come on who may not share their philosophy. It's also contradictory what they've said because Superintendent Ridge talked about needing approval at the highest level to use this. Deputy Superintendent McGoldrick says we can't wait for approval at the highest level to use some of these weapons. We need to be able to use them in certain situations. They've also contradicted themselves in saying we have a long history of not using these weapons, but there's lots of situations where we want to be able to use them. So we have a long history of peaceful and nonviolent protests in the city of Boston, at least over the last 30 years. I agree with both the police officers who've spoken about this, and that our police department in Boston has shown respect for the right of people to assert their First Amendment rights of free assembly, free speech, and petitioning the government for redress of grievances. For example, while other cities throughout our nation had hundreds of people arrested whenever the Democratic or Republican National Convention was held in their city, Boston hosted the DNC in 2004 with only 5 arrests, even though there were daily protests in the street throughout the length of the convention. We've had protests in the streets involving climate change, Black Lives Matter, immigrant rights, justice for janitors, Occupy Boston, eviction blockades, anti-war, women's rights, LGBTQ rights, and many more over the last 30 years. Often, these protests have disrupted business as usual in our city. They've been noisy, they've been boisterous, they've caused traffic jams and other inconveniences to city residents as people have stood up against injustice, inequality, and discrimination. I have been both a participant and a neutral legal observer at many of these demonstrations. And despite the issues that these demonstrations often cause, until recently, the Boston Police and other law enforcement agencies never used tear gas, pepper spray, rubber bullets, flashbang grenades, and other indiscriminate or dangerous crowd control weapons to disperse the people of Boston who are exercising their First Amendment rights. All of a sudden now they feel the need to have the use of those weapons. With the police murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Philando Castile, and so many more, and the increased activism of the Black Lives Matter movement, the Boston police have begun to use these dangerous weapons to try and stop the citizens of Boston from voicing their concerns in our streets. In fact, we have learned that the BPD has even been supplying tear gas police departments in other Massachusetts cities to be used against protesters there. The National Lawyers Guild has collected eyewitness reports from people and our own legal observers of the indiscriminate and unnecessary use of tear gas, pepper spray, rubber bullets, flashbang grenades, and other weaponry to try and disperse non-violent groups of demonstrators during several of the Black Lives Matter protests that have occurred recently. Indeed, our own neutral legal observers have been targets of these weapons at times. Bystanders and passers-by have also been severely injured by tear gas and pepper spray because those weapons cannot be limited in who they target or who they affect. People have been injured, they've been scarred, they've been frightened, and more importantly, prevented from exercising their rights as they've been able to do in the past. I want to read you one short excerpt from one participant in a peaceful demonstration in front of the State House on May 31st of this year, a demonstration that turned chaotic and dangerous to the participants and to the public solely because of the actions of the police on that time. This is what she wrote. The crowd was slowly trickling away. This was about 8 o'clock at night. But a large group of us remained standing at the State House. And that's when things got crazy. Out of absolutely nowhere, the entire group of people started screaming, pushing, and pulling, yelling, "Watch out," and "My God, get out of the way." It took moments, and all of a sudden, I got thrown completely out of the way as 3 police cruisers sped through the entire crowd of people, splitting us right down the middle with no warning. The screaming continued, and the whole crowd got chaotic and confused. Distress all around, people screaming. I fled Boylston Street and ran into the Commons as I didn't know where else to go. My partner and I got separated, so I ran around alone, scared and confused. The police trapped us in the park and had police at every accessible exit and corner. They were throwing tear gas and shooting rubber bullets into the dark park. Lights were turned off. We couldn't see where to go. The T got shut down, so we couldn't get out. The streets were blocked off with riot police who were shooting rubber bullets at anyone that came in their direction. I finally made it out after an hour or so, but I'm traumatized. I'm now afraid of helicopters, cops, cop cars, crossing streets, fireworks, fog, the list goes on. It turned one of the most beautiful days I've ever experienced into a true living nightmare. The person who wrote this account is too frightened about potential retaliation to come forward and testify in person before you. This is a prime example of how the use of these weapons now will prevent people from exercising their rights in the future. These demonstrations in no way required the police to use the dangerous and indiscriminate weapons to control peaceful demonstrators. In fact, it is the unnecessary use of these weapons by the police which creates the very chaotic and potentially violent situations which the police are supposedly trying to avoid. These weapons, like pepper spray and tear gas and other chemical crowd control weapons, are so dangerous and indiscriminate in their effect that the use of them in warfare was specifically banned almost 100 years ago by the Geneva Protocol of 1925. Yet today, our police are allowed to use them on our own citizens, exercising their constitutionally protected right to protest with little or no restrictions. Even more importantly, closer to home, Massachusetts has extensive regulations which severely restrict the use of such chemical weapons as tear gas and pepper spray on prisoners in our state prisons. Under these regulations, prisoners are more protected from the use of these harmful weapons than our citizens exercising their constitutional rights out on the public streets and in the parks. The ordinance being considered by you does not ban the use of these weapons. Rather, it places reasonable restrictions on when and how the police can use them. It serves to protect the rights of our citizens to engage in peaceful protests, and it provides consequences for police officers who violate those rights by using these weapons unnecessarily as has occurred recently. Similar or even harsher restrictions on the use of these weapons by police forces have recently been imposed by courts around the country who have issued
Attorney Fryer?
almost
Okay.
done. Who've issued restraining orders and injunctions against police forces in Denver, Minneapolis, Portland, Seattle, Los Angeles, and Washington, D.C., and lawsuits are pending in other cities. I urge you to pass this ordinance to restrict the unnecessary use of these dangerous and indiscriminate weapons in order to provide the same protection to ordinary citizens as we provide to prisoners in Massachusetts. Thank you.
Thank you. Attorney Hall?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Good morning to the committee members and to the makers of the bill. My name is Rasan Hall. I'm the director of the Racial Justice Program for the ACLU of Massachusetts. We are thankful that the council has decided to hold this important hearing and take up this very timely yet long-standing issue. The use of chemical agents and kinetic projectile weapons for the purpose of crowd control. The proposed ordinance does not go far enough, and I would encourage the council to consider an outright ban of these weapons. However, recognizing the perspective and influence of law enforcement and the public's perception of the need to control unruly crowds and the political realities of this moment, I realize that an outright ban may not be politically feasible. That said, this ordinance and this hearing and any subsequent working group must come as close to banning these weapons as possible. What this body ultimately puts forward is only valuable if it is much stronger than it currently is. The use of chemical agents which can cause physical injury, permanent disability, and even death, as Dr. Har has explained at length, is often excessive, indiscriminate, and a violation of civil and human rights. Tear gas, as many have said, has been outlawed as a method of warfare on battlefields, but those prohibitions have not extended to domestic law enforcement. And unfortunately, law enforcement personnel use tear gas all too often against peaceful crowds. And I appreciate the representation by Superintendent Ridge and Deputy Superintendent McGoldrick about the limited use in Boston. We have seen the indiscriminate deploying and use of chemical agents and kinetic weapons in this country for decades, but we should not be so naive as to believe that they have been used without controversy or in furtherance of maintaining dominant culture and the status quo. The use of these weapons in theaters of war led to their ultimate exclusion, and so we should similarly seek to exclude them in domestic settings. The so-called less than lethal weapons do not account for the significant injuries that have accompanied their use. We only need harken back to Bloody Sunday, as hundreds of peaceful protesters attempted to march from Selma to Montgomery in Alabama to demand the promise of full citizenship for Black people. The image of the recently deceased Congressman John Lewis as a young man and other brave, peaceful protesters being suffocated in a cloud of chemical weapons, batons, and hatred is seared into our collective memory. Uprisings in urban centers throughout the country during the mid to late 60s hearkened to combat scenes from armed conflict, only to reveal that students protesting the Vietnam War and Black people protesting police violence and generations of divestment and disenfranchisement were the true combatants. We look back on those images and times with the benefit of wisdom and a purported enlightenment and a lens of racial justice. This allows us to condemn those actions of police violence and uses of excessive force, but we struggle to see our current complicity with the continued use of these weapons that have no place in civilized society. Whether being deployed at the US-Mexico border to keep peaceful and desperate refugees at bay, or in the Pacific Northwest to disperse the masses of peaceful demonstrators, or in Lafayette Square in Washington, D.C. to quote unquote dominate those who sought to voice their demands for redress of grievances. The use of tear gas and other chemical irritants are an indicator of how much further we have to go as a nation. Similarly, the use of kinetic projectile impact weapons should be banned. We need to look no further than the city's own fateful history when jubilant Red Sox fans took to the streets to celebrate a long-desired victory, only to have the night come to a violent and deadly end. The life of Victoria Snellgrove, whose Councilor Arroyo has also offered up her memory, should serve as a stark reminder of the inaccuracy of the term less than lethal. Whether seeking to express joy or demanding accountability, we cannot allow crowd control weaponry that does anything but control a crowd. Any weapon that indiscriminately impacts those who are involved in disruption as well as those exercising constitutionally protected activity should not be allowed or used within this city by its law enforcement officers or any law enforcement officer within the city's boundaries. Our concern is that officers may be substantially motivated by an intent to interfere with individuals' constitutionally protected expression. The continued use of tear gas during the coronavirus pandemic could also result in significant health risks to protesters and increased spread of the virus. As Attorney Foyer pointed out, courts have also found any harm in limiting police use of tear gas can be outweighed by the irreparable harm that peaceful protesters engaged in constitutionally protected conduct are likely to endure. And so we cannot forget that anytime there is a serious threat to First Amendment rights, there is a likelihood of irreparable injury. And so with that, I strongly encourage this body to not only pass this ordinance, but to work strenuously to strengthen the ordinance so that we have the greatest protections for the residents of the city and anyone who is within its bounds, and also the protection of the principles embodied within the First Amendment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to start going through, starting with the sponsors of questions of the counselors. For the guest speakers, if I know some of you mentioned each other's names and whatnot, I don't know if you have the blue button on your screens, but if you feel the need to counter something or have a question for another panelist, please let me know. I'm going to do my best to traffic control this hearing, which is, I think, a very robust intent, and it's going to be a very robust hearing is all I'm saying, and I'm trying to traffic control this as much as possible. So please raise blue hands, and we're going to go ahead and start with our lead sponsors. It's 12:03 right now, and I would like to make sure that I've seen you. No need for the counselors to raise the hands. I'm going to go in order of arrival. The blue hands is for the panelists, excuse me, the guest speakers. I'm going to try my best to get through this as soon as possible. And there are not a significant number, but there are people who do have questions in public testimony. So I would like my counselors to do their best to keep this to maybe one round go through. We can go to public testimony. Is that okay with the lead sponsors? And then we can go back to counselors. Counselor
Sounds
Campbell?
great.
Okay,
Yep.
then. So let's get started. No more than 5 minutes, counselors, and even then try and keep it conservative, knowing that people are waiting to speak. Counselor Arroyo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And so I just want to be clear for everybody on what this does, because I was hearing a lot about banning and taking it from officers' hands. This isn't a ban. So first and foremost, though I know that there's a lot of pressure, and I agree with it, to ban weapons like this, that there's no ban here. What this is a restriction. It would require that BPD give warnings to the crowd. It would codify something that, if it's not in practice, should be in practice, is that BPD would give a warning to the crowd before they use any kind of chemical control agent or kinetic impact weapon, that they would then give time for the crowd to disperse, specifically 2 minutes before doing so, and that they would have to witness acts of violence and or property destruction before authorizing that, and that, as BPD has said is already their policy, would codify having only the upper echelon of BPD administration have the ability to okay the use of a weapon that is indiscriminate, that impacts entire groups of people, that can hurt and has hurt individuals who are not the essential target or the reason for their usage, and that can take lives. And so I think those are appropriate measures. This is not a ban, just to be clear. Nobody is taking it away from BPD. It's simply codifying language that protects constituencies and actually serves to de-escalate, give an opportunity for de-escalation to truly take place, and hopefully by doing so protect lives of both officers and our constituents. And so with that, just so everybody understands what's on the table, that's what we're talking about. And just for some questions, do we have Dr. Har still here? Thank you. I just want to, one thing that I saw recently and I'm very interested in, it came up during the recent situations, tear gas and other chemical crowd control agents, it appears, has a impact on women's menstrual health and reproductive health. Is that something that we've seen in data or science? Or I've seen a couple articles on it that there's been situations where it's actually had an impact on menstrual health, but I'm trying to get a better idea as to whether or not that's something that we have any data or science on.
That's a very good question. It has been coming up a lot. Actually, I think it's really important for women to report their experiences and for us to promote those voices. But from the medical side, there's actually no evidence that these findings, that tear gas disrupts menstrual cycles or causes miscarriages. I'd be a little bit afraid of intimidating women away from protesting if we make too much of a strong argument on that side without evidence.
I respect that. So one other question for you. Specifically, I've spoken to doctors about this, and what they said is different chemicals can have different reactions when medics try to treat folks with medicine or try to figure out what exactly the chemical is that they're having an issue with. Part of this ordinance would require the Boston Police Department, in their announcement that they're going to use these weapons, to state specifically what they're going to use. Is there a medical beneficial practice for that part where they say, this is the chemical we're going to use, this is the weapon we're going to use, for medics on hand or for the EMTs on hand, to know what is being used?
Yes, actually, as an ER doctor, I can tell you very clearly that would be hugely beneficial. Just as an example, pepper spray is typically an oil-soluble compound. So if I was a doctor trying to get rid of it, I would be more likely to use soap and water, whereas tear gas is water-soluble, like CS or CN, and just fresh air and lots of wind and maybe some water would help as well. PHR has documented, so Physicians for Human Rights, which we've been working on this for decades now, has documented that there's also newer chemicals in addition to CS, like the heavier silicated versions. And so it would be really important to understand if these newer versions are being used more and more often, because they tend to last longer. And someone mentioned about the environmental impact, but the newer versions tend to have a longer half-life, and so can last longer on the ground and in the air. And it would be really important to understand that as well, if those are being used more often or if they're not used at all.
Thank you so much. And then one last question, if I have the time, for the ACLU, or Jeff, whichever one of you can answer this, but I'm directing it to the ACLU. Have you had documented, any kind of documented data in terms of the suppressive effect that the fear of tear gas or kinetic impact projectiles have had on, say, lawful assembly, or folks who worry about that or worry about whether or not they can participate? Do you have any kind of data or tracking method for knowing whether or not it suppresses voice?
No is the short answer. There are certainly folks who have reached out to us expressing concerns about how to organize an event. And I don't have an accurate count of how many instances that would be. I could probably run through our intake and find out if we have numbers on how many people have called to inquire and raise concerns about those.
Is it safe to say, though, that you've received those concerns?
Yes, even in regards to the May 31st event, I had occasion to speak to some of the young people who organized, and that was one of the concerns that was discussed and raised. In particular, concern around engagement with proactive engagement with the police because of concerns related to how they will be deployed.
Thank you.
We've done, the National Lawyers Guild does a lot of training with activist groups about their rights, their legal rights to protest. And we've received numerous concerns about what will happen to them following what happened on May 29th and May 31st in Boston. People being particularly concerned about doing any kind of demonstration out in public and what kind of reaction they will get from the police as a direct result of the use of these weapons on May 29th and May 31st.
Thank you. So as the time is up, Councilor Arroyo, okay, Councilor Campbell.
Thank you, Councilor Edwards, and thank you again to the panelists, and thank you, Councilor Royal, for stressing the fact that this is not an absolute ban. And I respect Rasan and the ACLU's position that is, I know Councilor Roy and I have spoken about this, that's where we want to go and get to. This is, as Jeffrey has spoken to, what is not only a restriction, but a quite reasonable restriction. And so I guess I want to hear first from the police department, and thank you guys for your testimony. Has the department taken a position with respect to the ordinance? And then my second question is, you talked a lot about process and protocol with respect to these weapons. I'm curious to know specifically what is the process and protocol, and is that documented somewhere? And if so, can we get a copy of that through the chair? But would love to hear more around the specifics in terms of process and protocol, because I think based on what we've drafted, that the ordinance just codifies the existing practice of the department, which of course is also, I think, very reasonable. The ordinance is very reasonable because of that. And this is my son, Aiden, who will be with me for the rest of this, so say hello. Thank you, Councilor Edwards, and thank you to the police department. I might have another question or two, depending on how long it takes the department to respond.
Thank you. To either one of the officers. You're on mute.
Hi, thank you. So in regards to, I think I seem to be getting lost in the connotation of a peaceful demonstration and a riot. We don't use these weapons for any type of peaceful demonstration, and we haven't. These are used for riots. And I would say if you're at a peaceful demonstration and it turns out that the people next to you are starting to throw explosives, bricks, and rocks at the police, then you know it's probably a good time to leave, because that's no longer a peaceful demonstration. And I don't know who would argue that it still is. When we say that they're used indiscriminately, when you're being attacked, and we were being attacked that night, then the fact that I know Councilor Arroyo's talking about give them a 2-minute warning, give them this and that. Once it escalates into a riot, and we have to use those devices that we have, then I don't see the need that we need to start putting restrictions on it, because in the city of Boston, we're not using those unless we have a riot situation, and it's not ever used for a lawful demonstration and protest. When you start throwing M80s and frozen water bottles and rocks and bricks at the police, it's no longer a peaceful demonstration.
So Superintendent, just for I know I only have 3 minutes. So I hear you with respect to the distinction between the rioters and protesters. I guess what would be helpful to us is, one, it sounds like the department is not currently in favor of the ordinance as drafted, because that hasn't been made crystal clear, which would be helpful. And then the second is, what currently is the practice? Is there warnings that are given out if you are seeing something on the ground that is turning it from a peaceful protest to something more violent? or, what is the practice and protocol that you, the commissioner, and the department actually go through before you authorize use of these weapons? I guess more clarity on that would be helpful.
So when feasible, warning is given. However, in all circumstances, we can't say that we're able to give a warning. When somebody is under direct attack, the feasibility of giving a warning is not going to happen because they're being attacked right then. So you can't say, we'll let you attack us for 2 minutes and then we're going to retaliate or respond rather, is the appropriate word. But I just don't see the need to say that, no, you've got to have to give a 2-minute warning. Right now, when that stuff is being observed, and when we have these events, we've got numerous members of the command staff that are out there. They're observing this stuff. Between superintendents, deputy superintendents, captains. For the most part, our policy and protocol is that it has to be at that level before we disperse a crowd. However, when you're under attack, then the fact that you didn't get permission to use something because you're being and when I say use, it would be OC spray in particular, which is part of this ban on chemical munitions or restrictions is not feasible. So right now, you can, if somebody's under attack, direct attack, they can use OC spray. If they were to use, and the only thing that we have in our inventory is CS gas. If they're to use CS gas, then they have to get permission. That has to be given from the police commissioner or his designee. But the use of OC sprays on an everyday occurrence, when someone is being attacked, they do have the right to use that.
So then I guess the concern, and I have to wrap up.
Yep. Thank you.
Is that, based on your testimony, Superintendent, I'm sorry. Say hello. Based on your testimony in the deputies, clearly everyone has a different way in which they respond, some through communication, some through other processes. And so the fact that there isn't something that is consistent or standard practice is a little concerning. And so the goal is to try to get to a place where there's something in place, even after you guys leave the department, where there's a common understanding as to when these will be used, how they will be used, who has the power to authorize that, in what circumstances. So if there isn't anything written, if there is something written, I would love that through the chair to get that. And I can turn it over to my other colleagues. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And I will make sure to follow up on any requests. Councillor Flynn?
Thank you. Thank you, Councilor Edwards. I just wanted to follow up with Superintendent Ridge. I know you mentioned that during the Sunday evening, I think it was May 31st, Boston police officers were subjected to CS gas, pepper spray, and dynamite. Is that accurate, Superintendent?
Yeah, dynamite or whatever type of explosives. We currently have at least 2 officers that I'm aware of that have been out injured since then because they literally had an explosive device thrown at them and detonated basically right in their face. And if they didn't have protective gear on, they certainly would have lost sight. Both of those officers are currently out injured. In their return, and one in particular is in doubt because of injuries he received.
Superintendent, how many police officers were injured during this period?
We had numerous injuries in numerous degrees. There were over 20 officers that were hurt, and I believe I think we have 6 to 8 that are still currently out injured, from broken bones to, like I said, explosives going off right basically right next to their head.
You know, I'm all, like all my colleagues, for peaceful protesting. But what we witnessed on that Sunday evening, you know, the most people that were protesting peacefully. But what we also witnessed was the intentional violence against the Boston police at times, and for anyone to use dynamite or pepper spray or CS gas. So, Superintendent, if you didn't have the opportunity to respond with the proper response in terms of tools in your toolbox, what could you do if this happened again and you weren't able to, if we restricted you on what you could do?
Well, when we start, the more tools we take away, the less options we have. You know, to just put our officers out in the street with a baton and a service weapon leaves very limited ability to disperse a riot crowd. And again, I stress the fact that this was a crowd that was rioting. You know, setting fires, looting, damaging property. This was a rioting crowd, and the more tools that you take away, the less options we have. You know, to go back to the baton and use of a firearm is very disheartening to our people out in the street, that they don't have the proper tools, or these restrictions that will be put on them to think that every time that they use something, they're going to be second guessed, if you will, that you know, you really weren't under attack. There really was no need for that. Is kind of is, like I say, is disheartening to the men and women of the Boston Police Department, who are out there every day making sure that everyone's First Amendment right is adhered to. You know, we don't have the luxury of taking sides, you know, to come down on either side of any political issue. You know, we're there to do our job, and our job is to make sure that everyone has the right to peacefully demonstrate. And we've done that for many years without any instances or need for any type of restrictions.
Councillor Flynn, we're about that time. Okay.
Thank you, Councilor Edwards, and thank you, Superintendent Rich.
Thank you. Councillor Braden.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just had a question for Dr. Haar, if she's still with us, in terms of the long-term injury, morbidity from injuries from ballistic weapons used in riot control. Is there any record of long-term injury and disability?
So in our systematic reviews published with PHR in 2017, we found 293 people who had permanent disabilities secondary to the projectiles, like foam rounds, rubber bullets, that sort of thing. The majority of those are because of head injuries and eye injuries, but also loss of limbs and amputations and neurovascular injuries as well. I'll quickly just refer you, we wrote a letter to the Boston City Council that I think is in the record, outlining our studies and the injuries that you can always refer to afterwards as well.
Thank you. And then I also had a question for Superintendent Ridge. Are your officers trained in the use of rubber and the appropriate firing methods for rubber plastic bullets, whatever they're called these days?
So we have sponge rounds that are deployable, that we have in our inventory, and the sponge rounds are only authorized for use by our specifically trained officers. So there's a very limited amount of officers that have the ability to use the sponge rounds, and in particular, we have our SWAT people, and they go through training. The rank and file officers out in the street don't have those weapons, and they don't receive the training in those weapons because they're not authorized to use them. So in particular, no one is authorized to use any type of weapons or force unless they have been specifically trained to do so.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong. I know the original rubber bullets that were used in Northern Ireland were not intended to be fired directly at the person. They were meant to be bounced off the ground. What's the protocol for firing the sponge round that you're talking about?
The sponge round is, we call it a target-specific weapon. So they're particularly aimed at some person who is doing something so egregious that most likely would actually escalate, or in the use of force would probably justify the use of deadly force when you have someone throwing a
stick of dynamite.
Well, stick of dynamite or some type of explosive device. So its center of mass is what they're trained to hit, and then it's a kinetic impact weapon that because it's the sponge round, it kind of disperses. Again, it's less lethal. I'm not going to, we've heard the doctor, and I don't dispute that it can be lethal at certain circumstances, but the situations that we've used them in, it is actually escalated into the realm of the ability to use lethal force when somebody's throwing, as you said, the stick of dynamite or explosive at our offices.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you. That's all my questions for now, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Braden. Councillor O'Malley, then Councillor Mejia.
Or perhaps Councillor Sabi-George?
Oh, no, I apologize. My extreme apologies. Councillor Sabi-George.
Thank you, Madam
Councillor Sabi-George.
No,
yes,
you,
it is Councillor
Sabi-George. Thank you, everyone, for the thoughtful and thorough presentations and conversation to date to this time, and really understand. Just this morning alone, I have a better understanding. Of course, still have questions remaining, and that's what we're here for now. Has the rules for Superintendent Rich, has the rules of engagement, is that posted somewhere, or is that a shareable document?
Is it posted? It's part of our operational plan, which is law enforcement sensitive. That said, the commissioner would have to be consulted on whether he's going to release that. So, but it is disseminated to our officers in the form of the operational plan, what the rules of engagement are.
And are those based on, are those incident specific or event specific?
I would not say it's event specific. It's an evolved document, that has been, I guess, every time that we have some type of event, we constantly tweak our operations plans, and same thing, we kind of tweak our rules of engagement to include, the use of chemical munitions, whether it pretty much follows our rules and regulations that are available. And particularly, we have a rule for less lethal. We have a rule for non-lethal use of force. We also
and then how do you, for different events, and thinking back to the May 31st event, which a number of my colleagues have said, and I've said, the earlier rally and protests in March were incredibly peaceful and beautiful. I attended most of that day's events, didn't stay until the evening when things took a wild change there was a change in sort of what happened over the day, or over the course of the evening. How do you as a department and you as superintendent prepare for that event and make determinations on what being prepared means?
a lot of it has to do with past history, whether we have a past history with a particular group, what we can expect. Normally, when we have a demonstration, like I'll use, if we go back to the Women's March a few years back, when we had well over 100,000 people there, they were all there for the same reason. So we didn't have opposing groups, if you will. And sometimes that's what we look at, like what's gonna happen when this amount of people, if 100,000 people come out and they're all for the same thing, are we gonna have any issues? Or if we've got 100 people in 100 people and they have diametrically opposing views, what is the dynamic going to be that, what would that be? And we get that through intelligence. You know, we monitor how many people are coming so that we can kind of decide like what we're going to have for staffing. So, you know, we kind of look at a number of different factors that we get from intelligence, from the history of what we've had with these groups.
No, I appreciate that. I think I understand the rest of that explanation, and I appreciate that. I know that I'm short on time. From the May 31st of that rally and then riot on May 31st, do we have any data around injuries to both civilians and police officers? Because I'm obviously concerned about any civilian that has been injured, and also want to make sure that our officers have the protection and our other first responders, because I do know Boston Fire and EMS were also on the scene that evening. Do we have information or data around the injuries sustained by both civilian and first responders?
I do not have that readily available. As far as injuries to officers, yeah, we certainly have that, and it was well over 20 that were hurt. In regards to the civilian population, I do not have those figures for you, Councilor.
Okay, so I think I'm probably hitting up against my time. I am interested in the rules of engagement piece and how we are, you know, how we're making those decisions. Appreciate the explanation today and sort of can understand the logic behind it, but would like to see what that official protocol is and the official action around rules of engagement. That's it for me this round, Madam Chair. Thank you. And thank you to the presentations by all of the panelists today.
Thank you. Councilor O'Malley?
I'll go.
Yeah, I know you will. 1 second, Councilor O'Malley, and then Councilor Mejia. Okay, well, go ahead, Councilor Mejia.
Yes, thank you, because I am a little bit short on time. Just a quick question. Just curious, this is for BPD. Are we currently tracking incidences with chemical agents or projectiles that are used? And if so, is this information available public? Is there like a database? Is there like a dashboard where we can see and keep track of this publicly?
I will have to get back to you on where it's kept. Do we keep statistics on use of force? Absolutely, we do, and that is public. When you're asking specifically on this event, like how many, I don't have that information available, but we absolutely track all uses of force, whether it's you know, any type of chemical ammunition, OC spray, you know, hands-on or whatever we have to do. That is all tracked, and that is available.
Yeah, it would be helpful to know specifically around the injuries. So at some point, it would just a recommendation. I'm curious in terms of other tactics. I know conflict resolution and de-escalation. I'm not sure what other tactics are employed before we go to this route. Are there any best practices that the officers are trained in so that we're not moving towards causing harm to those who are peacefully or trying to protest?
So we have our supervisors, and what we train them when they're going through supervisor school is to engage with any and all sides of any type of peaceful demonstrations, so that we do have a dialogue, that we are talking to them, that we have a go-to person, if you will, if there's any issues, and they have, specifically a supervisor would be the intermediary for any issues that they were to have. And we do this rather very successfully through hundreds and hundreds of public demonstrations, where we identify some of the leaders, some of the organizers, we speak to them, we go, I ask them, what is the route? Where do you want to go? And then, we do our best to assist them with traffic control to make it safe for everyone. But yeah, they are trained to do that, to, again, come up with, make a dialogue so that you have someone to talk to.
And I'm curious, just in terms of when we're deploying officers to these scenes, are we looking at the rates of either aggression or officers that have been known to have anger management issues? Like, what type of prevention or framework are we looking before we deploy? Because I'm thinking that oftentimes, if there are any issues around anger management, that these things may escalate further. Just curious.
Well, I'm not sure how to answer that, but I'll just tell you that every officer is put into a squad, and that squad is assigned a supervisor, either a sergeant or lieutenant. And it's that supervisor's job, and they are trained to watch out for their people in their squad. Particularly, we train them if you've got an officer on the line, whether history or not aside, you might have an officer that's being specifically targeted and being taunted, and the supervisors are watching those officers. They're looking to see what's going on, and they do and have the authority to pull that person off the line if things start to be escalating with that particular officer, so they'll pull them back. But, I'm not really sure, answer your question in regards to, do we track certain people before going into that?
So then this is specifically in regards to the ordinance under Section D, Part 4. What is the current discipline system for excessive use of force? How is that determined? Does BPD plan to change their current discipline system in accordance with this ordinance?
Again, I'd have to defer to the commissioner on that in regards to any type of changes.
And then in the ordinance under exception, it gives the serving supervisor power in response to specific acts of violence. What specific acts of violence are we talking about? And how is that categorization being communicated to the public in a sense of what is considered an act of violence? I think communication usually is what I feel where we can strengthen our efforts, because sometimes what you all understand and believe as acts of violence is very different than the everyday folk. So I'm just curious about what act of violence looks like. How's that?
Well, I would say act of violence.
Yes, just noting that after you respond, Councilor Ridge, Councilor Mejia, that'll be time. Okay.
Very good. I'm just what's an act of violence? It would escalate to a physical assault. Name calling would not escalate into an act of violence, but a physical assault or against either an officer or someone else would constitute an act of violence. I think that's pretty self-evident. If you go to punch someone or throw something at someone, then that's an act of violence there.
Okay. I'm going to be mindful and I'm grateful for the time, and that's it for now. Thank you so much, Councilor Edwards.
Thank you, Councilor Mejia. Councilor Flaherty.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, and I just want to say thank you, obviously, to the superintendent. I know the commissioner's not on, but he's doing a great job along with the men and women of our Boston Police Department. And it was helpful to kind of run through what some of the protocols are, as well as the training and experience of the superintendent and his team as well. So I guess my perspective is everything's probably a balance. There's peaceful protest and there's demonstrations, and we get a lot of parades in our city, and there's obviously a lot of pride in our neighborhoods and in Boston's diversity. And then there are times when folks cross over the line, and that it becomes unpeaceful. Things get a little chaotic, and then I think what you guys have experienced lately with having bricks thrown at you and rocks and feces and bottles of urine, etc. So I guess at what point is a decision made when to sort of take a different type of action as opposed to sort of standing down, particularly in instances where you're outmanned or the crowd is so big and starts to turn violent. So I think we're all on the same page with peaceful demonstrations. Quite frankly, that's not what we saw recently in our city. Just take a walk down Newbury Street, and that kind of sums it up. But in any event, I want to get a perspective from the superintendent and his team as to sort of what goes in, what's the thought process that goes into when sort of a different tactic is undertaken.
Well, I would say a different tactic being undertaken is when it starts to escalate to a situation where if you don't take action, you're going to lose control. You're going to lose control of the situation. So you would need to escalate that. Is there a particular trigger point? If one fire gets set, it's okay. If two fires get set, that triggers this. That's not what happens. I mean, we take in the totality of the circumstances of what's going on there, and if we don't take action, what more will escalate, or what is the potential for it to escalate, and what damages could be caused. So you weigh the risks on that, Counselor. So there's no particularly like formula for it, if you will. However, when it escalates to a situation where we've about to lose control, and the only alternative is to use some of the other tools, if you will, in our toolbox, then that's what we'll revert to. Again, it's the totality of the circumstances of what we have going on at that time, weighing the risks of either taking inaction or taking the action.
And obviously, it's just as important, obviously, to protect the citizens of Boston and in our neighborhoods as it is to make sure the men and women that serve on our police department, that they get to go home safely to their loved ones as well. So I know that that's an important factor that goes into, I guess, all the decisions, making sure that we're protecting public safety, which is what you're charged to handle on behalf of the residents and taxpayers of Boston. At the same time, making sure that the men and women of your department are safe as well and have the equipment that they need to make sure that they do go home safely. Based on your experience, Superintendent, what percentage of those individuals, not, I guess, most recently, we know that one because I think that was reported in the paper, but overall, again, whether we go back to sort of like the St. Patrick's Day Parade and all the parades and festivals and other protests that we've had in the city, what percentage of those that are actually taken into custody are from Boston?
Yeah, again, it would be anecdotally for me. I don't have the specific numbers there, but there's the majority of those persons taken into custody in these demonstrations that are not city residents. I know just in past and again, you can look at our history. We tend not to make an arrest. We tend not to make an arrest more than most departments. We shy away from that. Our last resort is to make an arrest. But to get to your point, the majority of the people, and I can't give you a percentage, are from outside the city of Boston.
Gotcha. And we're obviously, and no department is perfect, and no police officer is perfect, but I do have to comment on the and the tolerance that I've witnessed firsthand in a number of different situations across the city over the years. So, and that's based on the training and the experience of our officers, arguably, which are the envy of cities across the country. So I appreciate the work you're doing. For me, again, it's about striking a balance. It's about recognizing peaceful demonstrations. It's about recognizing, the parades and the festivals, and tend to, there's a difference when someone's a little out of hand because of inebriation and what have you, and then there's when you cross the line and you start to hurl, bricks and smash windows and destroy cars and start lighting fires. It just takes on a total different perspective, and I think that the work that you guys do in trying to balance that is commendable. So again, no one's perfect. We should be learning after every one of our incidents in our city. But again, I talked to government officials, particularly contemporaries across the country, and they always talk about the work that the Boston Police Department does, and they wish that they had that type of police force in their jurisdiction. So with that, I appreciate your time and attention, and look forward to working with you and my colleagues on this to continue to learn and to make strides and move Boston forward. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I'm going to be brief because it's between me and public testimony and some questions. So I just wanted to note, I've heard 2 incidents today that involve these non-lethal force rubber bullets and tear gas. I've heard of the 31st, and I've heard of 2004. And I did want to note that it's worth recognizing that. I haven't heard of other incidents, for example, of the misuse of force or the impact on those in Boston. So I think if we're going to be clear and talk about Boston, we need to be, while I think other cities can inform, we have a unique and different, we're not LA, we're not Minneapolis, we're not those cities in terms of the policing or the issues. We do have our own issues, but I just wanted to recognize that I've only heard of 2 incidents today. So if we may hear more from public testimony, and I look forward to hearing from that. I firmly wanted to echo Councillor Campbell's comments. I just believe with all the people here at this table, city councilors, attorneys, and police officers, that we can together come up with a protocol that strikes a balance between the practical needs of our officers and the civil liberties and safety of those who are protesting. I know that we can do that. And what I hear from this is not, and as Attorney Hall noted, this is not a ban. But I do think what's key is, and what I'm hearing people ask for, is a clear understanding of when you do and don't use this. I'm hearing from the officers that those lines blur very quickly, and 2 minutes does seem like a long time to feel the need to start to use tear gas or a rubber bullet, and then to give a 2-minute warning. That seems very far in distance to me. I have organized protests myself. The first thing I did was call the local police officers and tell them that we're coming and where we were going to be. So that is a protocol I'm not unfamiliar with. As you mentioned, Superintendent Ridge. So I've done it, and I've coordinated that, and we were right in front of the person's house, and they knew about that, and we were left alone. That being said, I think it is now, as Councillor Campbell, as Councillor Arroyo, as my other colleagues have said, we're now in a different moment, a different time, where people are calling on us and questioning how we've done business. And again, I want to acknowledge I've only heard today of 1 incident in 2004 and May 31st. That's, I think, a good thing. Again, we may hear from more people today, but I think we should walk away with the goal of having a standard understanding of what the protocol is. And I think with you there, with the officers there, we can do that. And I think that's a reasonable request, considering that we don't ever want to think that we're scared of regulation, or that we're scared of being clear about how we do things in Boston. If anything, I want it to be out there for the whole world to know. So that's all I want to say. I did want to ask either of the police officers, either of the superintendents, when Attorney Foyer mentioned farming out some of our materials to other cities, do we do that? Do we give tear gas to other cities in Massachusetts? Do we give rubber bullets to other cities?
So I am not aware of us farming out stuff. I know that we don't we do not have a huge because we don't use this stuff very often. May 31st was the first time that we have a small inventory of that those munitions, again, because it expires, so there's no sense buying it when it expires and we're not using it. I know that after that, we depleted all our resources, and we borrowed stuff so that we would have an inventory, and I would have to look into it for you, but I believe some of that was giving stuff back that we borrowed from other agencies.
Okay.
But again, that's what I believe happened. I'm not going to say that's exactly what happened, but I know we ran out of our own stuff because we don't have a very big inventory of it because we don't use it, and it's got an expiration date. And I know we borrowed stuff to put back in our inventory, and then at some point we bought chemical munitions to resupply what we borrowed and to have our own inventory of that. That's what I surmise he's referring to, but again, I'll have to look into that to see if that happened.
Thank you. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to public testimony, or at least allow for members of the public. There have been 4 people who signed up in advance to speak. I do see other names, so I will first go through the first 4 the names that I see, and then other people can raise their hand if they are here to testify. I have, the names I have are Michael Ruiz, Anna Jeffrey, Olivia Dubois, and Zachary Lone. We'll start with Michael Ruiz. Are you there, Michael?
Hi.
Very well. And just before you start, so we can get as many people, we'll probably keep public testimony to 3 minutes.
All right, that sounds great. Okay, so thank you very much, members of the council, Madam Chair. Thank you for having me today to provide public testimony on this matter. So my name is Michael Reese. I'm an engineer by trade and a community activist and advocate. So I know that we've all witnessed in person or in news media really brutal crowd control tactics that have resulted in people having lifelong disabilities. So I'm here today in support of the ordinance restricting the use of chemical crowd control agents and kinetic impact projectiles. I strongly support this for 2 reasons. First, as a bioengineer by profession, I have studied the effects of chemical agents used in biological warfare. These are the same chemical agents that are being used here in our cities. And the effects of these chemical agents is not minor or even moderate as a deterrent. The molecules disperse into the air are meant to overwhelm our lung cells and chemically choke humans. I believe it's inhumane to use chemical agents against peaceful protesters. And let's be clear, our neighbors that disagree with us politically are not our enemies. We are compatriots in the struggle towards forming a more perfect union. Now, secondly, I stand in support of this ordinance because it's the right of every American citizen to peacefully protest and assemble without fear of our government's retaliation. It's an inalienable right granted to us by our founders. The national conversation going on about criminal justice reform has really conflated the difference between peaceful protesters and rioters by lumping them both into violent factions of society. Now, I've witnessed firsthand peaceful protests across Boston, and I stood in solidarity with members of my community asserting unequivocally that Black lives matter, that Black trans lives matter. But I also did witness the aftermath of the destruction that occurred on Newberry Street. And I hated seeing my community in that situation. So I want to say we can't allow opportunistic agents of chaos to diminish the movement for human rights. We must prioritize de-escalation training. I myself have de-escalated a person with a gun that had me in a chokehold and was mugging me. So I know it's possible. Deadly force or slightly less than deadly force is not an acceptable initial course of action for crowd control. And I'll close by saying that I offer my full support to enacting and enforcing this ordinance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anna Jeffrey. Just call her name one more time. Let's see if she's here. Anna Jeffrey?
Hi, sorry about that.
Okay.
So thank you so much to the Council and Madam Chair for allowing me to speak today. My name is Anna Jeffrey, and on May 29th in 2020, I was pepper sprayed by a Boston police officer while I was attempting to film an arrest at a Black Lives Matter protest. I am really uncomfortable being here today because I was really lucky. I have been to other protests before. I knew that this was a possibility that it could happen. There were a lot of other people who weren't prepared. There were people who had contacts in, which is a horrible thing to get pepper spray under a contact lens. There were also people who just weren't psychologically prepared for the possibility of violence. But having that privilege means I should be here to talk to you about what lucky looks like. So lucky was I saw it coming, which a lot of people don't get. Lucky was I managed to blink in time. So most of it ended up on my eyelids, and I was just blind and hurting every time I tried to open my eyes to see where I was going to get away from the danger. Lucky was standing in the street knowing there are people almost close enough to touch and yelling over and over again, I've been sprayed, I need help, I've been sprayed, I need help, and not getting any answer until I finally took my N95 mask off, which I was saving for an emergency. Having to expose myself to all of these people here, winding up clutching that mask in my hand as a stranger with the patience of a saint finally flushes my eyes out while I'm cursing and punching the pavement. You know, Lucky is going home with the only bruise being from punching the pavement, and Lucky is going home. A lot of other people don't have that. They were too scared to speak after. They got hurt at the Common when they were trapped. And I just want to remind you that what I was doing when I got pepper sprayed, when I was specifically targeted for pepper spray, was filming an arrest. And I really want this council to think long and hard about whether the message you want to send to the city of Boston and the people of the Commonwealth is that filming an arrest is the sort of stupid game for which you deserve the stupid prize of a face full of pepper spray. Thank you.
Thank you. Olivia Dubois? Dubois? Apologies. Olivia?
Hi, I'm here.
Okay.
On May 29th of this year, I attended an action that began in Terrence Coleman Park in the South End. Attendees brought water, masks, signs, and loved ones as they marched to District 4 where people stood together. Attendees chanted, I can't breathe, Black Lives Matter, say his name. And the Boston police came armed with guns, batons, chemical weapons, and bikes that they used to create a wall between protesters and themselves. For much of the action, I stood back, often being across the street from District 4 Police Station. But at around 7:30 p.m., I walked across Harrison Ave toward the crowd. I stood with the crowd for about a minute before I heard the Boston police yell, move, 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 and I started to run back as I felt people being shoved and hit with batons behind me. Seconds later, I heard screams from people being trampled. I felt my eyes begin to burn, and I saw the Boston police spray something into the faces of several other attendees of the action. I saw attendees fall to their ground, screaming in pain. I was lucky enough to avoid direct contact from the spray of the chemical, but the remnants of the chemical in the air could be felt by many of the people who stood across the street from District 4 Police Station. I think it's important to point out that this action was attended by people of all ages and abilities, families and young children. People living in the housing complex across the street from District 4 came out to show support for the action, along with many children from the neighborhood. After the police used chemical weapons, community members tended to those who were directly sprayed with the chemical. People provided aid with water and milk, pouring it all over the faces of the people who were sprayed. I went to check in on my friend who stayed across the street during this time. I asked her, do you know why the police started pushing people? Because from my vantage point, I saw no reason for the police to respond so violently. She said, I saw one of the police drop their bike and it seemed to startle the rest. That's when they started pushing. So to summarize, the Boston police used chemical weapons in addition to batons to move attendees because one of them dropped their bike. Thank you.
Thank you. Zachary Lown? Zachary?
Hi, I'm just trying to get on. It restarted me when you called my name. Sorry, just 1 second. Okay, can you hear me and see me?
You are good to go.
Okay, thank you. So my name is Zachary Lown. I practice law in Boston, and I'm a board member of the National Lawyers Guild. I wanted to begin very quickly by just sharing some photos. Are you able to allow me to share photos? I also have them on my phone, which I could hold up.
I can check if you, if screen sharing, go ahead.
Oh, you did give it to me?
I don't know. I'm going to check if we can give you screen sharing. If not, it might be more efficient if you held up your phone right at this point. Okay. I'm going to check. Sorry about that.
So not a problem. I'll hold up my phone. Sorry, I wasn't sure as to the technology. So as I said, I'm an attorney. I practice law in Boston, and I wanted to begin by just sharing a couple photos if you're able to see it. This photo is of the May 29th demonstration, and I believe that I think it was Councilor Campbell who asked about the specific instances of crowd control weapons being used. If you look, you can see one of the officers spraying pepper spray in that particular instance. And we heard counselors ask for, a couple of counselors ask for a catalog of police officer injuries. Some also did ask for injuries in terms of what happened to the people of Boston who came out to protest. For the record, we did receive, the National Lawyers Guild conducted intakes, and we did receive over 30 accounts from different people who were injured by the police officers' use of crowd control weapons. The other thing that I wanted to just touch on really quickly is that I think there's a misconception here in terms of the incidents when the officers use these weapons. The officers on the panel, a couple of officers, spoke over and over again about a riot. There are various videos out there. They're available on YouTube. We can send them to the counselors. The demonstrators are passionate and loud, but you can watch the videos for yourself and decide whether they depict a riot. I'm going to try very quickly to hold up another video. Sorry. Not ideal. Thank you for your patience. So this is in front of the police station on May 29th. And you can see the video is very short, but you can see initially that people are chanting and protesting, and officers spray them at about point blank range as they are crowded in front of the police station, shouting about their grievances. So I'm not going to try and do that. I have several other videos. I won't try to pull those up, but I will say that the claim that the officers used weapons in only the most extreme circumstances against violent individuals is plainly contradicted by some of the testimony that you heard today, and also by many of the accounts that we received from individuals who did not know each other and provided accounts that were largely consistent and interlocked on the key points. I hope that is something that the council will take extremely seriously and take into account. And I would like to say that one sentiment which I do echo is that the proposed ordinance would go to regulate those instances.
Yep.
I'll conclude on. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. There are other people who have signed up, who are in the waiting room. I am asking you to raise your blue hand in order to testify, so I can allow for more public testimony. Anyone else would like to speak? Okay. I'm going to go back to my colleagues and check in with them in terms of, or if do any of the panelists have any that they'd like to respond to very briefly with what they've heard? Okay, Rasan has raised his hand. Rasan?
Thank you. I just, one of the points, and I think Zach just spoke to this briefly, and maybe Councillor Campbell alluded to this as well. With the notion of the need for officers to respond, a particular concern of mine was how Superintendent Ridge continued to refer to this as a riot. Which is very inflammatory language, and I just question whether or not there is some discernible metric as to what makes a riot, as opposed to a group of individuals who are engaged in disturbing activity, when the overwhelming majority of the people there are engaged in peaceful protest, albeit boisterous. So that's one thing, like, that needs to be distilled. What constitutes a riot, as opposed to several individuals being disruptive and engaged in quote unquote violent activity or destruction to property. And then secondly, to the extent that there is some sort of metric, and I also appreciate Councillor Campbell's point that, you know, for as much as folks want to celebrate what BPD is currently doing well, this current command structure is not always going to be in place. And so we want to be able to lock in the protections for First Amendment protected activity to peacefully protest and demand redress. But, you know, what are the protocols that get put into place to determine what escalates something to a riot, besides someone's kind of gut feeling that this is a riot, particularly in light of how provocative that language is?
Thank you. Attorney Foyer?
Thank you. A number of the councilors have talked about the need for balance. The superintendent and the deputy superintendent have talked about that as well, that they need the ability to be able to use these weapons. They don't want to use them regularly. They only need to use them in extraordinary circumstances. And there has to be a balance then on the other side as well. So we cannot count on the police to always behave reasonably, consistent with their rules. There are police officers who behave badly. We've seen that throughout the country. That's what the entire movement is recently about this. And we cannot always count, as Mr. Hall just said, we cannot always count on the police to behave reasonably and carefully in every situation. So when there's a riot, the police want the ability to use this. The public needs protection against the police misusing these weapons. And that's what this ordinance is about, placing reasonable restrictions on it. And I want to remind you again that these protections already exist in Massachusetts. These restrictions already exist, but they're only for prisoners, people in our prisons. The public, the general public, our ordinary citizens, do not have the same protections against the use of these weapons that prisoners in Massachusetts do. And that's what this ordinance addresses. It places reasonable restrictions, the same kind of restrictions that protect prisoners will now protect ordinary citizens out on the streets exercising their First Amendment rights.
Thank you very much. Unless Superintendent Ridge or Deputy Superintendent would like to say anything, I'm going to go ahead and go through the colleagues for concluding remarks.
It's Deputy Superintendent McGoldrick. I would just say, relative to the 2-minute issue, it's the exception that the police are the targets. Usually we're protecting one group from another group, and we're trying to mediate whatever issues they're having and protect one side from the other. So that's where I think the 2 minutes is really problematic. It's not as problematic for the police to try to hold back for 2 minutes before using whether it's OC spray or other tactics. But I think there's going to be some unhappiness with the police response if we allow, or if we don't effectively control violence for the 2 minutes while we wait. So I think to make that a hard and fast rule is a little problematic. So not even be able to use pepper spray while there's active assaults going on, I think presents challenges that people may find unacceptable, that are both trying to present their view, exercise their First Amendment rights with two different opposing groups, so that we both have an obligation to protect. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Superintendent. So with that, I'm going to go through my colleagues for kind of remarks, continuation, whatever. And I will start at the beginning with the two lead sponsors. Councillor Arroyo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I just want to be clear again as to what we've heard and what we didn't see or didn't hear. I heard some reference to what I guess can best be summarized as general practices. The protocols may be secret, may be released, or may not be released. I'm not sure. I didn't really pick up on what that was about in terms of the protocols for engagement. But neither of those are regulations, which is really what this is. And the reality is, when we talk about looting a store or breaking a window or throwing a water bottle, those, generally speaking, aren't lethal activities. And when we talk about kinetic impact projectiles, when we talk about chemical crowd control ordinance, that has the ability, every time that it is used, to lead to the loss of life. And in this city, in Boston, it has led to a loss of life. It can kill every time it's authorized. And that's the reality. And so when we're talking about we don't have the time to issue a warning of 2 minutes so that a crowd can disperse. Somebody brought up, if people around you are throwing dynamite, then you should probably leave. I agree. If people are throwing dynamite, I probably wouldn't want to be there. But the reality is, if somebody threw a stick of dynamite and I was next to them and I had no ability to leave because the response was immediate and I get hit with pepper spray or a rubber bullet, that's not acceptable either. And so we have to have a real common understanding that, this isn't a ban. We're not taking the tools away from BPD. You still have them. There's a bid currently out for 1,500 canisters of pepper spray. You'll still get that. The question is about how it's implemented and how it's used that best protects civilians and Boston police officers. The thing on the table is a 2-minute warning. I haven't heard anything about crack protocols. I've heard differing accounts that in order for tear gas to get dispersed or kinetic impact projectiles, the commissioner himself has to sign off. This doesn't change that. It actually allows for deputy superintendents and above. So if anything, it actually increases the amount of people, from what I've heard, who are allowed to sign off on this. And so, I just want it to be rational when we have this conversation, that we're not talking about removing the ability for Boston Police Department officials to use this in instances that merit it, but simply that if they are going to do so, again, this is lethal, possibly lethal material and ordinance, that they do so with a warning for the general public, that they do so with certain safety protocols, and that's it. And so I look forward to having a future conversation about all those things and seeing whatever protocols you may have on paper moving forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Councillor Campbell.
Thank you. That was my mother-in-law who just literally smiled as she walked by. You're on camera. I just wanted to quickly, you're on camera. I just quickly want to thank Councillor Roy. I think you summed it up well, along with many others, that, based on what we heard today, it's not an absolute ban. I think we all agree to that. We talked for a long period of time before putting this ordinance forward, because we were mindful of the fact that the department wanted to have a robust conversation, but we also were mindful of the fact that an absolute ban probably wouldn't go anywhere. And so we were starting from a place that was, we think, extremely reasonable, given what we've heard from our department today. We obviously want to protect our residents, and we have to strike that balance with protecting our residents and, of course, protecting our public servants, our police officers. And right now, based on what I've heard today, I'm still confused as to what the specific protocol and practices are with respect to using these weapons. And I do think this ordinance allows us to codify and all get on the same page as to what that is, which is incredibly important. I think the public has a right to know every practice or protocol that we use in any department should be public information. I'm a strong believer in doing away with keeping things under wrap or even having people have to request what these protocols are. They should be on a website somewhere. They should be listed somewhere. And in this particular instance, I think they should be codified given the fact that we are talking about lethal weapons and severe injury to folks from the public. I want to thank those who actually had the courage to come forward and share what happened to them in some of these incidents. I think it's extremely courageous to do that. It is not easy to get in a public platform and to share what happened to you with respect to our police department. I also want to follow up through the chair. If there is a lot of my questions around, do we track this information? Is there something in writing or more in writing with respect to this? Any of those updates would be extremely helpful. But I do not think this should be a long, drawn-out conversation in terms of passing this ordinance. I think it's extremely reasonable. I think we've created a space where if the 2 minutes is too long, given the expertise of our police department and police officers who are out there on the front lines, what is more reasonable? Is it a minute? Is it shorter? What does that look like? If there are other provisions in the ordinance that are unreasonable, let us know, but it's hard to make edits or changes if we do not have specifics as to what the police department thinks is in the best interest of our officers. And of course, you know, Deputy and Superintendent, you guys have a difficult job. You've been doing it for decades. We want to defer to your expertise in many ways, but we need specifics as to how to make this better. And I think we both, Councilor Roy and I, have gone on the record that we think these tools are dangerous and at some point really need to have a robust conversation around a ban of some sort. But right now we're talking about a reasonable restriction, codifying a practice and protocol with respect to when we use these so it's not ad hoc, it's not random. And lastly, offering some enforcement for when officers do actually make mistakes in using pepper spray and other tools available to them. What we have not talked about as much during this hearing is what came up during the public testimony part, which is some bystander or someone who is not doing anything illegal being pepper sprayed or something happening to them, and there's no accountability with respect to those incidents. That's a major issue too, with respect to this conversation. So again, looking forward, Chair, to working through you to get this done in short order, and whether it's another working session or another hearing, defer to you. But again, thank you to Councilor Royo for the partnership. Thank you to all of our panelists. I know how busy you all are for participating in this conversation. And thank you to those who offered up public testimony, and as well as my colleagues for the questions they asked, which were very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Councilor Campbell. I believe some of my colleagues had to step away, but I do want to thank Councilor Flynn. I want to thank Councilor Asabi George. I want to thank, I think Councilor Braden also had to step away. I want to thank Councilor Mejia and Councilor O'Malley. And, well, Councilor Flaherty, if you're still with us, did you have any? Yes, Councilor Flaherty.
Yes, thank you. Just wanted to, again, it's about striking a balance. So I guess if the opportunity presents itself to, I guess, issue a warning that, say, tear gas, for example, is to be deployed, obviously, you know, and it's in the best interest of public safety and community and safety and obviously and to protect people's property. That's one thing. We just don't want to be in a situation where we're telegraphing our punches, to borrow a phrase, when I boxed as a kid. So we obviously want to, again, strike that balance. Some of the folks that we're seeing that are part of these protests, they're not there to be peaceful. They're pretty sophisticated. They're financed. They've got you know, their own technology and weaponry itself. So I just want to make sure that if we're going to issue a warning, you know, we do it with relatively short period of time to let folks know that it's important that they disperse the area immediately and give them, I guess, the time to do that. But in general, I always want to make sure that the tactics that we're taking is in the best interest of public safety, and we're, and protecting residents and the visitors, property owners, and obviously the men and women of the police department, so that they get, again, as I referenced earlier, it's important that they get to go home safely to their families as well. So where appropriate, strike that balance. Things start to get a little crazy, maybe you issue a warning, but I want to make sure that it's tight-ended, because you don't want to make sure that you don't give any advance to those that are not here to be peaceful, that are not looking to be law-abiding, and that they have the resources. And you guys are seeing it. We're seeing it across the country. Again, pretty sophisticated group that are hell-bent on wreaking havoc and being destructive. And I'm not quite sure it makes a lot of sense to give those individuals a heads up and a warning, but I think for the general public that are there peacefully protesting, that's one thing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Flaherty. I will just simply conclude by saying this conversation will continue in a working session, unlike with the surveillance ordinance, where there was an understood on all sides that the technology was not sufficient, or was it reliable. We do have a difference and a real concern about the use and banning, or at least restricting, of the use of these tear gas and these and rubber bullets, if you will. I do think that, to echo Councillor Flaherty, what he just said, and to echo Councillor Campbell, there's not only a balance to be struck, but a warning, I think, is the most reasonable and low-hanging fruit, that we could at least start from there. And I hope the police would agree to some form of warning, because at that point, if you are there protesting and you are warned, listen, in a certain amount of time, we're going to deploy tear gas. If you start to see people move, and then you start to see people advance towards you, I think you'll be able to discern very quickly who's there just to protest and who's there to cause some trouble. So I think it actually might be helping you to shrink the haystack if you're giving opportunity for good, abiding, protesting people to leave and move on about their way. And so I do agree. I do understand that the folks who are on the ground, who are facing the back and forth. Again, we ask our police officers to have the coolest head and to rise to the occasion when everybody around them is falling apart rapidly. And so I just wanted to echo that I understand your service and decades of it, and also the fact that we are talking about pretty much 2004, May 29th of 2020, and May 31st of 2020 also speaks to the fact that we have, in some cases, many cases, majority of the cases, good police work happening here. So I do want to acknowledge that. But should there be codified standards that all are aware of? I absolutely think that makes sense. So I look forward to having a working session and working with the police to get to that balance. With that, unless anyone has anything else to say, I'm going to conclude the hearing, and we'll be scheduling a working session. Thank you very, very much to all the participants.
Thank you, Councilor Edwards.
Thank you.